Welcome to the Sacred Thread podcast, where we explore spirituality, psychology, and the deeper questions of what it means to be human. I'm your host, Winston Janusz. Welcome back, everybody, to the Sacred Thread podcast. My guest today is Diana Butler Bass, historian, theologian, one of the most trusted voices reimagining faith for our time. Through books like Grounded, Grateful, Freeing Jesus, she's helped countless people rediscover a living, breathing spirituality rooted in love and presence. And her new book, which is her 12th one, A Beautiful Year, 52 meditations on faith, wisdom, and perseverance, invites us to slow down and live by sacred time, recover a rhythm of grace in a distracted world. Diana, welcome back, and thanks so much for joining me.
Well, it's good to be with you, Winston, and it's been too long. 5 years of a break between my last podcast visit and this one seems forever. We
Yeah,
had like an entire pandemic between then and now.
I know. And we were talking about Freeing Jesus, which had, I think, come out recently at that time. So yeah, but hopefully we'll have fewer years between our next one, right? But no, it's an honor to have you on, and I'm excited. Today is actually, I don't know if the podcast is probably not going to come out today, but for those of you who are listening, we're recording this on the day of that the book is released. So it's out now. You guys can pick it up. But yeah, curious to talk more with you just about, maybe we could start with what inspired this book.
A Beautiful Year was not entirely a book I planned to write. The way it was birthed was actually through the pandemic. And early during those years, we had no idea what was going to happen. And I can remember in the very first months after lockdown started, my manager, the person who books my speaking engagements, called me up and said, I have some really bad news for you. Every one of your speaking engagements between now and the beginning of next year has been canceled.
Oh my.
And it was like an arrow into my heart. For one, I'm an extrovert and I love being with people, and it was so sad and hard to think about not being with my readers or in churches or doing the kinds of teaching that I do on the road. But then two, that was my income. Uh,
Mm,
I'm like most writers. You don't live off of your book royalties unless you're John Grisham or somebody who's like super famous. Book royalties are not the way that we pay for groceries.
mm,
We're just sort of like any other really hardworking folks where we write books and we do other work, teaching, speaking, preaching. Those were the things that I did in the world.
gotcha.
And so there I was at age 61, looking at my work and my life going forward. And I thought, is this it? Have I just been put into forced retirement before I'm ready, before I can even receive Medicare?
Mm,
And how am I going to pay for health insurance? And there's a global pandemic and all kinds of just awful questions, thinking that my working life was over. And it was when I was in that kind of really scared and depressed state. A friend of mine, who's also a pretty well-known writer, Nadia Boltz-Weber, she writes about religion, spirituality as well.
yeah, of course.
Told, yeah, and she told me that she had just started writing on this new platform on the internet that was focused for people like us, focused on writers.
Mm,
And she said it's called Substack. And I think you should go over there and set up a newsletter and start connecting with people that way. She told me her experience of it, and she had a very good experience. So this was fairly when Substack was still fairly new. I think it was only about 2 years old, and
mm,
people were only just beginning to be vaguely aware of it. And so I did as she suggested. I began to write a newsletter on Substack. And it was from that place of being in total isolation that I reached out via this new technology. And I'm kind of a Luddite. I don't really like new technology. And I just gave myself away. I'm at the very end of the baby boom generation, and some of us are, kind of scared and reluctant too about new technology.
I'm
So,
I'm starting to get there myself, to be honest with you. So,
well, there's so much of it, and
yeah,
AI is a whole different kettle of fish.
right.
But so anyway, I was just like, okay, I'm going to try this new thing. And I did. And all of a sudden, I just found myself really loving it. And people started finding my work and signing up for my newsletter. And eventually, what happened was I created a feature every week called Sunday Musings,
Hmm.
where I would take the Bible passage from a resource that's called the Revised Common Lectionary that's used by a lot of liberal churches around the world. And I would reflect on that passage with my community. And I began to write these Sunday musings. And lo and behold, I must have gotten hundreds, if not thousands, of notes from people saying, I love your Sunday musings. Please keep writing. Is there any way I can get them on Saturday to help with my sermon writing? Can I get them for my adult study group at church?
Mm.
Can I share them with my friends in my book group? And so that whole experience, I began to think, oh my gosh, maybe Sunday musings could form the backbone of a book. And so eventually that's where Beautiful Year came through.
Mm.
It was birthed in my own self-doubt and sense of fear in the pandemic. My ability to sort of reach over a technological divide and try to find a different way to connect with readers and other human beings, people I really just like being with. And as I began to explore that, I found my own voice as a writer in a new way.
Mm.
And folks really responded, and they began demanding that this material be something more than just random essays on a Sunday that they have stashed in a file somewhere on their computer or on their phone. And so A Beautiful Year was born out of that. And it's not just simply a random collection of stuff from Sunday musings. It takes the insights and the larger sort of stories from that I worked on in Sunday musings and puts them together in an interesting narrative form.
Yeah, yeah, very cool, very interesting. Yeah, like I mentioned to you, Substack is relatively new to me. I only discovered it earlier this year, but it seems like a great space. So the whole mission of sort of supporting writers,
Mm.
and I think I was looking in there where you can see like in the categories of writing, faith and spirituality. I think you and Nadia are in the top 10. So well done, you know. But yeah,
That was one of the joys of it. At first, when people started signing up, there were like I think five progressive
oh wow,
Christian women in the top 10 writers. And we would sort of look at each other and say, where else does this happen?
right.
This is, we're not usually given this much space or are able to have this much sort of positive power in any media company.
Mm.
And here was Substack, and they were not only happy that we were with them, but they were thrilled that there was this really interesting group of women who were having such success. So I'm really a fan for that reason. And Substack as a company has been super supportive of women writers, which is not the case in most of the media.
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that they're a lot more supportive as a company. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of how I started my newsletter on Substack, The Sacred Thread. And then that kind of evolved to, oh, I miss doing the podcast. Like, you were on my previous podcast, which I took a long break from and then reinvented it. And now this is the Sacred Thread podcast, kind of getting into those themes again of progressive Christianity, contemplative spirituality, incorporating some of my background as a therapist and meditation teacher as well. That's something I forgot to mention to you that I did in the past 5 years. I went through a certification program, 2 years, to become like a mindfulness meditation teacher. So, I love the contemplative aspects of things, and I wonder if that ties into your book at all in terms of the idea of sacred time and kind of a new experience of the year, of time itself. And I'm just kind of curious to learn more about how would you describe sacred time and how that's different from our ordinary secular kind of experience of time and the calendar. If you could speak to that, maybe.
The secular calendar is interesting. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago on much of social media, there was this funny meme, and the meme was a woman with a camera would ask a male friend of hers, "How often do you think about the Roman Empire?" And they'd hold up their camera, and their male friend or partner, husband, brother, whatever, would answer the question. And as it turned out, the way that this meme unfolded on the internet was that men think about the Roman Empire a whole lot more than women do. And I remember when I first saw this meme, I was puzzled by it because I have a PhD in the history of Christianity, which means I actually think about the Roman Empire all the time. So I was going, am I weird, as a woman that I think about the Roman Empire? And so anyway, I got to considering this really funny sort of situation in which I find myself, and I started looking around to see how much we're still influenced by the Roman Empire. And one day it dawned on me that a primary influence is the secular calendar.
Mm.
And if you look at the secular calendar, every single one of those months is named after a Roman emperor, a Roman god, a Roman celebration, or a Roman numeral.
Ah, yeah.
And so it's like, hello, this is the year, we're in the 21st century and we're still using a calendar that was originally shaped 2000 years ago. And the days of the week in English, half of them are named after the same Roman figures. Half of them are named after, it's like someone went wild in some century and decided to name half of the days of the week after Norse gods.
Oh, really? Didn't know that.
But none of them are named after anything Christian. And supposedly, this is the Western calendar. This is the calendar that Western Christendom had used for all of its centuries of existence. Wait a second, what's weird here? And why is it that we're keeping time in the same way that they essentially marked time? They marked a year
Mm.
in the ancient Roman world. And there were variations along the way, but the structure, the deep structure, is still a structure of empire.
Mm.
And I began to understand how calendars tell stories. And if you look at the calendar that we use in the West, and particularly here in the United States, North America, Canada, our calendars basically celebrate very similar kinds of things that these more ancient calendars celebrate. And that is, they celebrate political leaders. They celebrate
Mm.
oftentimes very famous heroes that are military heroes. They celebrate victories, military victories. They celebrate the triumphs of the state. And they also celebrate, interestingly enough, our economic system. And so there's all kinds of holidays and holy days, I call them now, where you have Black Friday, or you have Amazon Prime Days, or you have bank holiday.
Mm.
And so when you look at the calendar, the secular calendar, it's not really secular. It's a celebration of militarism, um, imperialism, the sort of the triumph of the state, as it were, and economic transactionalism.
Wow.
And I went, I don't want to live inside of a story like that. And that was my moment of realizing that I actually lived inside of another story. And that is, as I grew up Methodist, I journeyed for a little while in my life through the evangelical sort space, and got myself born again and all those things.
Hmm.
But then I returned back to the Episcopal Church, which is, that far more traditional, liturgical, old kind of denomination.
Right.
And it was from both my Methodist childhood and the Episcopal Church that I knew that there was another calendar that shaped who I was, and that was the Christian calendar. And that meant for me that I was actually living with two different senses of time. One was the secular calendar that was based in imperialism and militarism and economic transaction.
Hmm.
And then the other is a calendar based around the life of a guy who's called king, but that king kneels at the feet of his friends. He washes their feet. He talks about giving away all of one's possessions to the poor. Um, he doesn't hold on to or grasp worldly power in any way. He dismisses paying taxes. I mean, if this is a king, he's a king with a kingdom unlike anything we have ever known here on earth. And the rhythms of the calendar are entirely different than the secular rhythms of the calendar that hangs on my wall. And so I thought, what does it mean to live in this tension of these two calendars? And so that's what I began exploring on my Substack pages on this in Sunday Musings, to really lift up the stories of Jesus that are anti-imperial, that propose a different kind of economics, one based in gratitude, and that um, aren't that are nonviolent. And so then I began retelling the Christian story over the course of several years on Substack, and I realized that I had actually talked myself into, or written myself into, being a stronger, braver, wiser, more compassionate Christian by following the Christian year. And that's what I really wanted to share with my friends, is that I I I sincerely trust that if we have an alternate sense of time, one that can challenge and is in tension with the way we keep time now, we're going to find that deeper sense of identity. And I think it gives us more reserves to be the kind of people we dream of being.
Beautifully said. Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. I mean, very fascinating. This whole idea that there was a certain kind of consciousness that gave rise to the Roman calendar and that perception of time, which continues to it it continues into even into this day, that state of consciousness that gave birth to that is influencing us here and now. So it's interesting when you talk about how living into the calendar affected you and impacted you in a spiritual and personal way. How would you maybe give us a taste of what that's like to what does it mean to experience time in a different way, like for somebody that maybe doesn't have familiarity with the Christian calendar, those rhythms or that consciousness or those rituals, etc.
There are two ways that I think that I'm impacted. And the first, I want to give you just a really practical example, and then we can talk about that second way, that's a bit more mystical and I think a bit more sort of theoretical. So is more the second thing I'll talk about, I think, is more for people who might be in the contemplative tradition,
Mm-hmm.
or experimenting in a life of meditation. But the first one is really super practical. Since we're recording on November 4th, next Tuesday is November 7th. Or 11th, excuse me, I can add. Add 7 days to 4 and you get 11. And November 11th, of course, is in the United States Veterans Day. And in many, if not most other English speaking countries, it's Remembrance Day, which is a celebration that grew out of the end of World War One. And so we have on November 11th, essentially in across the English speaking world, um, a celebration that really did begin as a celebration of nationalism. It started out as a victory celebration of the Allies over the Axis countries in World War One over Germany, and the imperial sort of arrangement of the Kaiser. But back then we're still talking about kings versus kings
Hmm. Hmm.
because that's what Europe was shaped like. So
Mm.
just a different kind of imperialism one, and that was British imperialism, which was somewhat more democratic, quote unquote, unless of course you lived in Africa or India or some other place where you were under their boot. And so we have a celebration of the victory of imperialism. And over the course of the last century, since the end of World War One, that's sort of softened, as people have been more reluctant
Gotcha.
to embrace empire. So it now turns into remembrance. It's a remembrance of people who gave their lives for a greater cause. And in effect, in the United States, that's what it works out to. It's a day to remember veterans, the people who mostly died in America's wars. And so that's what sacrifice means in many of our cultures. Now, I'm not saying that those things aren't sacrifices. Those things are sacrifices. And there are political systems that are legitimately worth giving one's life for.
Hmm.
And I think we're feeling that right now here in the United States.
Mm.
But these are very particular sacrifices. These aren't teachers who go out and lay their lives down to be with Indian children on the reservation and to affirm their languages and affirm their culture and tell them that they're worthwhile as human beings and they have dignity. I mean, it's not like picking up some stream of North American history that would celebrate the good people among us who did the right things, even when everybody else was doing something that was not so good. It's only looking at a very small slice of heroism, and that is military heroism in the service of what was then an empire and now are mostly kind of capitalist empires, as it were.
Mm.
And so that's the holiday that is on our calendars.
Right.
But there's another holiday on their Christian calendar. And this isn't in the book, but this is the kind of thing I do in the book. Um, November 11th is also the feast day of Saint Martin. Saint Martin lived very early in Christian history, and he lived at a time when it was considered to be morally improper for a Christian to serve in the army, in the Roman army. Christians should not be in the military. So if you chose to become what was then called a catechumenate, a person who was learning the Christian faith, you would be asked questions about this vocation if you were in the military. And Martin, when he wanted to become a catechumenate, he was an officer in the Roman army, as was his father. And so this was the family tradition. Um, Martin really began to have serious questions about this as he learned more and more about Christianity. And at one point in his journey, he had a dream. Well, this is the legend that wound up around it.
Hmm.
Is that Martin was going down the road in his Roman military uniform, and he saw a poor man on the side of the street, And he got off of his horse and he took his Roman military cloak off and put it around the poor man and gave it to the poor man so that the man would be clothed. And that night, in a dream, Jesus appeared to him and said, Martin, you are going to be a soldier only for me. And that it was the legend is it was that dream that then inspired Martin to go ahead and get baptized. And as a result of being baptized, he gave up his military commission, and it was much to the dismay of his father. Um, and it was also kind of a dangerous thing to do. Be a Roman soldier who gave up your service to Caesar to follow Jesus. That was not a safe choice
Right.
in at Martin's time. And so the early church celebrated Martin as a great hero of the faith for giving his military cloak up to protect the poor rather than to wield the sword for an empire. Throughout Christian history, that day, November 11th, was mostly celebrated until till the early part of the 20th century as St. Martin's Day. And throughout Europe, it was a very popular holiday in which people would actually go out and give alms to the poor, that they would go out of their way to take care of anyone who was in distress and who needed help. And it was a kind of a celebration in that sense of that was greatly a sort of it was a happy day, because it was a celebration of real community from the richest to the poorest. And the intention of the church was to remind people that our lives, that there's always something we need to give up in order to protect the least of these, and that we all have cloaks that we can put around someone else. And so, isn't that a tension?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is November 11th? Is it a celebration of only a very narrow band of heroism, which is heroic? I do not deny that. And I do not deny the service that
Right.
people's relatives give to the military, or they themselves have given. But there have always been questions in Christianity about the nature of the service that is being rendered in the military and how it's connected to violence when it comes to the life of the Prince of Peace. And so there's that. And then there's the story of St. Martin. And my question is, well, which one? You know, how do these two things relate to each other? Where do you find your primary identity as a person
Mm.
of faith? And if you're not a Christian, which of these stories do you admire the most? Do you admire a story about extolling military heroes who killed other people, actually other people of the same faith, so that an empire would win? Or do you really find that pretty compelling that a young man of privilege would get down off of his horse and put his cloak? I mean, really, I mean, that was the cloak of status and wealth and position and power. And to take that off and put it around a poor man and then say, okay, this is what I want the rest of my life to be like. And to do it. I mean, that's Martin followed that way. He eventually became a bishop in the church, and that's when bishops were not dressed in gold and living in
Mm.
palaces. This is when bishops were very ragged leaders of community trying to protect people from persecution of the empire itself. And so these are, to me, these are the kinds of questions that should shape our moral vision of community and our moral vision of ourselves.
That's a very powerful and beautiful example. Yeah, you're doing a good job selling the book. If that's what's in there, I gotta read it as soon as I can. You know.
There's all
Uh,
kinds of stories like that in the book, and people go through it
mm,
and they go, "Whoa, I'm learning church history here. I'm learning theology," and none of it's dogma.
hmm.
It's all to me little um the old movie, Forrest Gump, when he opens up a box of chocolates. That's what a beautiful year is like. You open it up and you just sort of take a bite and it's like, whoa, I love caramel.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I had listened back to our just kind of trying to prepare for this conversation, and saying I should go back and listen to our conversation we had 5 years ago, and this has been a consistent theme I think for you, and it was back then when we talked about, okay, what is the story that's being told? How do we tell a different story, especially when it seems like the story that is being so prevalently and predominantly told is not necessarily leading us to good places at all.
Mm-mm.
And it's interesting too because there's such a psychological component to this. It's reminding me of now my primary work during the day is as a therapist, and I'm struck always when I talk with people and I remind them the mind is a storyteller. That's what it does. It tells stories and constructs narratives and makes meaning out of things. And we need to be reminded of that the mind is always telling a story. What is the story? Is it a story? Where is that story leading us to? Right.
That's right.
And people, and when they realize, oh, maybe this isn't the best story, that helps their mental health, right? Okay, is there an alternative story about what's happening in my life on an individual level? And I think what you're talking about, right? This is why I'm drawn to it. It's like we're talking about sort of like the ultimate depth psychology of what is the psychology of us collectively as a society.
Yeah.
And I just it's just tough because it makes sense in a way that people do worship and value very power that's very obvious, the kind of Marvel
Mm-hmm.
Avengers, the billionaire power. We want that us represents safety, freedom to do what we want, and so many of us are in pursuit of that type of power. And what you're talking about is really, in a way, a kind of reversal of that, it seems, but one that is so needed and necessary for us, I think, to function well as a society. But how do we get everyone on board with that, right? But I think what you're talking about is this, just okay. Here are examples of what this looks like. To what do we celebrate? Who do we remember? Not necessarily to the exclusion of those who have given their lives, I think, like you said, but remembering that the different ways, the different kind of ways that love shows up, right?
Yeah. And, this is sometimes, I talk about in this very dramatic sort of contrasting example of November 11th. Um, but you can also see it in a much, and what I would think of would be a similar contrasting example that's very public. And that is the idea of Martin Luther King Day. And throughout the southern states, Martin Luther King Day was in conflict with Confederate Veterans Day. And so you have really two incredible examples. One of a preacher who's preaching love and justice to celebrate him, who died as a martyr, if effectively, to both American democracy and his vision of what it means to be what it meant to be a Christian person. And then you have also a different idea of what a Christian empire should look like, and who are the heroes of what it meant to die in service to that empire. And so, wow, we do this all the time, essentially, is that we're making choices between these two narrative stories as larger communities and as a nation. And to me, this is actually super important work. And I love the way you frame it as a depth psychology, because I think that's really what it is. I think that the primary people ask me all the time, you know, "Oh, how did we get here? How did MAGA get so popular? Why did all this happen? How could people, I mean, quite literally, how could people vote for Donald Trump?" I get asked these questions. And for a while, I would say, I don't know, it's baffling. But now I actually say it's not baffling at all.
Hmm.
Is that we're really in a tension or a contest, as it were, between two stories of who we are going to be as individuals and as a nation. And those stories have different narrative structures and they have different narrative ends. And that's the second point. And I'll just make this really quickly because I think that you'll appreciate this, is that the second part of your question about, what does this mean? What's the shape of time and what's the shape of the story? Is that the Roman calendar does something not only that's very obvious, having all those names in Latin, but it's like it has a beginning, middle, and end. You literally go to you have a clear celebrative start to the year. You have like a blank slate in front of you. You get to the end, December 31st, you take the calendar off the wall, you put a new one up. And then, everybody says goodbye to the old year in Times Square and says hello to the new year this way, beginning, middle, and end.
Mhm.
And that's how we've been trained to think about years, is that they're linear and that they function in this kind of seasonal fashion and that they have certain storylines. Like today, while we're recording, it's my book launch. It's also the 1 year anniversary of the election of 2024.
Mhm.
And so there's tons of news on television that's looking back over this last year to see how this year has unfolded. And so we're looking at the end of a process that started 1 year ago. And
Mm.
it's kind of, it's a false marker in certain ways. It's not the end of anything. But yet we act as if we come to ends, at certain dates. And that means that history runs only in one direction. And if history runs only in one direction, you have to have winners and losers. You have to have, and if something goes awry while history is running in the direction that you like, you have to figure out how to stop history, fix the problem, and then redirect the end of history in your favor.
Mm.
And so when you have linear history, it creates this deception, as it were, of both utter control and complete determinism. Because you can say, oh, well, that's just the way history unfolds. There's nothing I can do about it. It's in the hands of people who have more power than me. I'm just sitting here for the ride. I have my head, sort of ducked down. All I want to do is reach the year, get to be 80 or 85 years old and, see my grandchildren graduate from high school, whatever.
Mhm.
And so linear history actually creates either sort of megalomaniacs who think they can control everything, or it creates very submissive people who feel like everything is out of their control.
Mm.
Um, but the Christian year is not linear history. I mean, I'm actually figuring this out more as I'm talking about it on podcasts.
Yeah.
And it's amazing the way you can write an entire book about something and then realize, oh my gosh, there's so much more here than even I knew when I was writing this. Um, the Christian year, it starts not with January 1st, it starts around December 1st with the beginning of Advent. And it celebrates absolutely nothing on the first day of Advent. It celebrates, it says we're waiting.
Mm.
It's like, what kind of New Year is that? Standing in the middle of Times Square and the ball drops and excuse me, there's no cheering, just silence.
Mm. I like where this is going.
Mm.
Silence and meditation, right?
Right. I'm taking a sip of my tea for folks to, as they hear my bad cough here. Well, I got so excited about the fact that there's nothing to do.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it, right? That does sound like a dream.
Yeah, it really does. So you go through the first month of Advent, and what are you doing? You're sitting in the dark lighting candles. And that's a strange way to start. And what happens is that there are these questions that begin to be whispered in the dark. And those questions are things like, what are you hoping for? What do you dream of? What freedom are you seeking? And as those questions begin to grow, what we're waiting for, of course, in Advent is Christmas, the birth of Jesus. The Prince of Peace arrives, the angels sing the whole deal. And then you go through 12 days of incredible celebration. Those are the 12 days of Christmas, which happen after Christmas Day, not before. And that's what commercialism has done to us. Capitalism tells us the
Mm.
12 days are before, so we buy stuff. And
Wow.
then the narrative shifts again. It shifts to Epiphany. And Epiphany begins with a very harrowing story. Epiphany begins with a story about the king of Israel, King Herod, who tries to kill Jesus. And because he doesn't want his throne threatened, the emperor is terrified that he's going to lose his throne to a new king. And so he winds up killing all of the babies that could be anywhere near the same age as this predicted birth of the one who is born to be king. And so as soon as you get through the angels and all the celebration, the empire, I mean, literally strikes back
Yeah.
and says, we're going to take it all away. This is a false hope. The only hope is in the kingdom that I run. As you know, I am the one. I am the promise.
Mm.
And so you move through Epiphany from that really evil moment. And through Epiphany, you have this vision of the spreading of light. That, yeah, it seems like it's really evil now, but the light is going to overcome this long, horrible night. And so there are all these stories about how that circle of light grows. You get to the end of Epiphany, and there's light everywhere. As a matter of fact, there's a beautiful verse that's read that says, You are the light, referring to the people of God, referring to the followers of Jesus. And to go from the light being extinguished to the vision of you being the light, you are the one who carries light into the world, is dramatically beautiful.
Mm.
And so then you move into Lent. Oh no, it's dark again. Now we're talking about death. And from Lent, you move to Holy Week, the the main act, as it were, of the Christian story, with both where you have in the middle of Holy Week, which is the last week of Lent, you have Jesus having a feast with his friends, the Last Supper. I sometimes refer to it as the first feast, just to be subversive about it. Yeah, you have the Last Supper, which becomes the basis of the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. And then you go from that, a celebration, to the cross, where the empire basically kills Jesus
Mm.
and says, You think you were having fun last night? Too bad, your feast is over. We're the ones in charge. And this guy's a troublemaker. We're getting rid of him. And we hope that the rest of you will just go away. And then Easter Sunday, boom, the big surprise of the story. The guy they killed comes back from the dead. Who knows how, but there it is in the story. And 50 days later, that guy somehow disappears from the planet. The feast is called the Ascension, that Jesus goes to be with his Father, goes to be with God. And then the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, falls in a very dramatic way on a new community. Now, you would think that's the end of the story, but that's the middle of the story in the Christian year. And from then, for the next half of the year, the next 6 months, a season that's called Pentecost, all you have are stories about us. And that is how the people who hear the story of Jesus, how we listen to his teachings, how we enact it in our lives, and how we treat our neighbors. That's the second half of the story. And so what you have is not a linear, in other words, you have not a linear story. You have a story that starts in the center, in a sense, in the middle, and then it radiates out to the sides and then radiates back to the center. It's more like a pulsar
Hmm.
of time, or a labyrinth, or a circle. It's curved. It folds back in on itself, and it goes deeper, and then it goes wider. It's an entirely different sense of time. And it's a sense of time that we're not just staring at or being acted upon, but it's like it's like the edge of a sea where you can walk into it and you then become part of the motion itself. And so it's an inviting, embracive idea of time, that we're in it. And it doesn't exactly repeat. I don't want to kind of get into that determinist idea of history always repeats itself, but it does echo and rhyme, and it does have patterns that re-show themselves over these cycles. And so the cycles are not endless. So I would always think of its repetitions as more like spirals rather than strict repetition.
Hmm.
And that kind of time is very powerful.
Yeah, those are powerful images. I like the kind of metaphors and analogies you use there for what it's like. Uh, I wouldn't say that I have much of an in-depth knowledge growing up of the Christian calendar. I mean, we all know Christmas, Easter, those basic things, and never really went a whole lot deeper with it. But you're making me want to really experience time in this way, just and see what that is like. Because it doesn't necessarily feel like I have a firm grasp on an experience of like what time would feel like if it felt like that, like how you're describing, you know?
Mhm. Well, it puts things in a different perspective, because if you're talking about pulsing or spirals of history, um, versus living in a timeline, and we're living in a really scary, horrible moment in the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
If that's your measure of history, you either love this or you're hiding in a closet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that what that does, what a timeline history does, is it elevates our moment as if it's the most important thing that will ever happen, because it might be the most important thing on a timeline view of history that ever happens in all of our lives. But what if that's not what time is? What if time is something else? It repositions the moment we live into a much sort of wider frame. And that, what that does, for me at least, and I would hope this would do the same for you and for people who like, the work that you're doing, and certainly my readers, people like the work that I'm doing. It gives us that perspective to be able to say, okay, this is really important, and it really is having an impact on real people, and there's real fear, and there's real effects, and there's real starvation. So things are really happening. And at the same time, in the sort of the scope of this pulsing of love that emanates from the center of all that is, it really is pretty small. And so if it's pretty small, instead of thinking, oh my gosh, the big ogre is going to get me, it means that I have some agency here to be able to stand in the midst of this moment, which I feel like will never be over, and speak a different power, speak a different wisdom, speak a different courage into it, and say, hey, rise up, because this is not the way that it is always going to be. There have always been, uh, you know, tin pot dictators through
Mm-hmm.
all of history. And just because one has now come to America, it's like sort of, well, let's welcome ourselves to this really horrifying club
Mm.
in human history and say, well, we weren't exceptional after all. So what did we do? Well, the people of God, people who were following a way that was based in love, said, we're going to take off our cloaks and we're going to take care of the poor. We're going to speak truth to evil. We're going to keep walking, even if it has a cost for us. And it's not just Christians, of course. Jews have their own calendar. Muslims have a calendar that shapes their sense of identity. Hindus, Buddhists, all of the great world religions have distinctive calendars, and every single one of those calendars lifts up themes of love and light and mercy and forgiveness over and against the powers of empire. And so if Christians kind of get that, that we're really sort of just part of this larger human quest to see and experience time differently, that's been expressed in all of these different faith traditions and by different gurus and wisdom leaders through many, many centuries of human experience. If we see that that's kind of the core of who we are, that gives us the ability to step out of Christian nationalism. It gives us the ability to step out of MAGA. It gives us the ability to speak differently in our churches, our faith communities, and it certainly gives us a really great way to have a very different kind of conversation with our relatives and friends that might have been sadly brainwashed into a story that they think is the truth, but is really a lie. And the lie is not just external, but the lie can take over your whole soul.
Yeah, yeah. Powerfully said. It kind of, and it's like, okay, what is that lie? And what is the I guess I've been obsessed a little bit lately with, it's maybe almost an impossible task, but like distilling the story. Because I think I actually heard you say on another podcast that, MAGA has a great story in some ways, in terms of its clarity. Uh, and there's a reason in some ways why it has kind of taken over, like you said. And, and we touched on that last time we talked, I think. Okay, so that a lot of progressives, or maybe people on the left, theologians, love using that kind of complex language to have done a lot of great work in recent decades theologically, but does it have the same kind of power in terms of its clarity, right? And being able to articulate it in just that kind of clear and even brief kind of way. How would you distill the story?
Oh, I know exactly how.
All right, great.
I just said the center of the story
Mm-hmm.
is that those days leading up to and right after Easter. And so that's the heartbeat. Everything in the Christian year beforehand moves down from the edges of the circle into that middle moment, which is actually in effect the beginning. So the beginning is in the middle. The language fails us here,
Yeah.
but and so then the middle is changed by what's going on at the very center, by the very heart of the story, and then you begin to move out toward the edges again. And so what's at the very center? That is a very interesting question, because Christians have traditionally thought that what's at the very center is Jesus hanging in a bloody death on a cross. And one of the things that we said about that was that the Jews killed him. Now, if you think about that being, if you think that's the very middle of this story, the dead body of Jesus hanging on a cross, killed by Jews, you're going to, for the next 2,000 years, act in some very particular ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we can look at the church history and see many of those ways, and none of them are good. But what if, and this essay is in the book, it's a book in the very center of the essay, or it's an essay in the very center of the book called Holy Thursday Revolution. And what I suggest, and I think this is the most important essay in the book, and it comes in the very center, because that's the structure of the Christian year.
Mm.
I suggest that the cross is not the point. And that sounds so heretical, I know. But what was the point was the table the night before.
Mm.
The table was the point. The feast was the point. The washing of the feet was the point. Jesus calling the people sitting around the table his friends, that was the point. And if we understood Thursday, the feast, the supper, as the last supper of empire and the first feast of this new beloved community that's going to grow and be throughout the entire earth, that is going to seed the universe in God's dream for justice. If we imagine the table as the main point of the story, it makes the entire story different going forth into the future. And there are Christians who have envisioned that in the past. I think Martin Luther King Jr. was one of them. We talked about him earlier. And he imagined a beloved community that was set around a full table of equality. He actually talked about what he called the world house. He also talked about a world church. And a world church wasn't like Christianity taking over everything, but a kind of Christianity that melted into a community of love and a community where God's dream was accomplished. That in effect, it would become the ideal of what Jesus was pointing to and what we call church, the best possible vision of it. But a world house. And what's always at the center of a house? It's
Table.
not it's a table. It is the table. A door lets you in and you bring people to a table. And so to me, that's the story, is welcome to the table. Welcome to the
Beautiful.
feast.
Yeah.
Send out invitations, pull up chairs. And so you can tell that entire story in just a few words. And what that means, of course, is that the cross then turns into the ruination that happens when you let empire take over the table. Oh my gosh, it's a horror story.
Mm.
And then Easter Sunday becomes God's intention is that empire will never win. So even in the most shocking of possibilities, that Jesus is murdered by empire in order to stop the feast from that table from ever being set again, God says no to empire. God says no. And to me, that's Easter Sunday. God says no to empire and instead sets a table again. And if you look at every one of the Easter stories, and this is also in the book, every single one of the Easter stories that happens in the season that follows the resurrection, they almost all take place around tables. When Jesus comes back, he never goes and points to some hill far away and says, look at the cross, gaze on the cross. This is the point of everything. No, Jesus sits down and asks his friends for broiled fish.
Good old Jesus. The
Good
religion.
old Jesus.
Yeah. The religion of the table. Table theology. Yeah.
That's right. And so that's, to me, the story. You can have Make America Great Again on hats, or you can send out dinner invitations.
It's beautiful. Right. And that includes everyone. I've been reading a little bit of Gregory Boyle lately, and he says at one point, God is inclusion. And that really resonates and kind of makes me think of what you're talking about, that's the center of the story. That in a way, and he also says right next to that, God is in the loving, and so that's where God is, at the table waiting for us. Right.
That's the feast.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good note to end on. Although I don't know, maybe we don't have endings because we have a new version of time, right? I don't know how we. Yeah. But...
Well, I won't give away the end of the book because I I do have to deal with that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
After you write a book that makes a claim that there's no such thing as linear time, you have to figure out how to end the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it reminds me too of my because my background with meditation and mindfulness, and this idea that there's a I wonder how much of a connection we can draw there, maybe for another conversation, but just this idea of the eternal now, which Meister Eckhart talks about, Richard Rohr, the naked now.
Yeah.
This is present not only in Buddhism and in modern psychotherapy, but also in Christianity too. This idea of,
Yep.
in some way, the present moment is central, is a non-linear kind of vision of time. But
Yeah.
anyway,
And I just think that a very, 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 very corrupt and bad form of Christianity has brought us to this terrible moment in linear time. And so it is really up to uh, Christians to help correct it
yeah,
and to enter into the story in a new way and say, hey, look, we got a whole bunch of stuff wrong in our history, but at the very same time, our history also includes exactly what you're talking about. Um, because the truth of it is that Christianity, no matter how hard it tried, it could never get away from these deeper realities that sometimes its imperial ambitions uh, were hiding.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Diana, for being on the podcast. It's an honor to have you on. If you're listening to this, go pick up a copy of A Beautiful Year. It's out now.
Thank you.
Check out Diana on Substack, the Sunday Musings, and all the writings she does there as well. Anything else you'd like to add to that? What people can find you online, etc.?
No, this was lovely. Thank you for giving me such a warm environment in which to share things that I'm deeply passionate for and about. And I enjoy being with you very much.
Thank you. I did as well. Hopefully, it'll be less than 5 years until the next one. All right. All right, Diana. Take care. Bye bye, everybody.